Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen inflation now ratchet up even further, 4.9% per annum. This is high. This is the highest in decades, especially once we take out that GST induced effect back in the early 2010s. I mean, these numbers are certainly going to be causing concern across a number of sectors. Households are seeing these higher costs. Businesses are having to try and grapple with how much they pass on and still meeting their own higher prices that are coming forward. What is driving this inflationary spike we're currently seeing?
Well, it's right across the board. I mean, there's been a lot of talk with the pandemic and the disruption that has had on international shipping and freight, and that is certainly playing a role. We look right around the globe at those shipping costs, and they have been rising significantly. We've got, of course, rampant demand, not only within the New Zealand economy, but globally as consumers get back out after lockdown and restrictions and all that type of thing. Many of them have saved a lot of money. There's been a lot of government spending that's gone on and fiscal stimulus that mean there's a hell of a lot of money flowing around in the system trying to be spent, and there's still the same amount of goods and services, or in many cases less goods and services to be buying because of those supply issues as well. So a lot of international stuff there. When we look domestically as well, of course, we've had higher electricity prices through much of this year, which have impacted. We've had higher fuel prices as well. Petrol prices are up over 20% on where they were a year ago. Food prices have been rising. And then we've got capacity constraints and sort of labour shortages, skill shortages coming through, which is impacting, particularly in somewhere like the construction sector, where we've seen construction costs for house building rising at about 4.5% over each of the last 2 quarters. Those are crazy quarterly numbers, and those cost pressures in the labour market are going to get broader as well. So like you say, there's a lot of concern there in terms of households and what it means for their sort of spending power, given what incomes have been doing.
Absolutely, and I think that's the challenge, right? For a lot of households going forward, they are starting to be hit more by this inflation. I mean, nearly 5% per annum, 4.9% is a lot. That's coming forward on top of those previous increases. We're now in the sort of hottest inflationary period we've seen in a fair while, and that does mean that households are starting to look at those costs. A lot of those costs that they can't actually move. They still need to drive around. They need to buy that fuel that's sitting at nearly $2.30 a litre. It's gone up to nearly $2.50 in some parts of the country now. They still need to buy the food, even though tomatoes and broccoli and that have increased, by massive amounts. They still need to be putting a roof over their head, either by trying to build a new house, which is 12% per annum more expensive, or trying to, still keep their rental going, which is costing more and more as those rents continue to increase. So across the board, we're seeing those pressures. We also know that for a lot of Kiwis, wages are rising, but not enough to keep up with these inflationary pressures. In the June quarter, we saw wages up 2.1% per annum over the year. But when we looked into the numbers, 73% of New Zealanders either didn't get a pay rise or had a pay rise that was less than inflation over the last 12 months. So for every step forward with a wage increase, households are still taking 2 steps back, and very much now the money that they have is not worth quite as much. They can't buy as much with it. And with that, there seems to be this rising feeling that inflation is going to be more persistent at these higher levels, quite possibly for longer than first expected. We're seeing these supply chain disruptions continue to across the economy. We're seeing that the amount of stimulus pumped in here in New Zealand from the fiscal support and similar, but also all of that support overseas and a number of other advanced economies, that's meaning there's more and more cash in the system, but still not quite as much to go around, or at least not as much to respond to that higher level of demand. And all of that does say that we could well have that inflation holding higher. Also, because instead of making one price increase and leaving it at that, we're hearing more and more businesses that are saying they're putting in additional price increases time and time again. And that does seem to be ratcheting up that pressure in the inflationary area. I mean, all of this does suggest, again, we've got now inflation at nearly double what the Reserve Bank's target band should be. What does that mean for interest rates? Surely it's going to push them higher.
Yeah, we've already seen the Reserve Bank lift rates once, but with the official cash rate at 0.5%, it is still incredibly stimulatory. It's well below what we saw at any time prior to the pandemic coming along. And even if the Reserve Bank goes ahead with a program of lifting the OCR to maybe 1.5%, 1.75% by the end of next year, that is still, you'd have to say, stimulatory monetary conditions. And the economy, clearly, given the imbalance between demand and supply, doesn't need that amount of stimulus. So the pressure is on the Reserve Bank, despite their speech and the rhetoric about taking considered and careful steps. A 50 basis point increase, or more than 150 basis point increase, does start to have to come on the table. Look, we've had inflation lift from 1.5% to 4.9% in the space of 6 months. And we know that it will take time for the Reserve Bank's actions and any tightening that they put through to have an effect. So the pressure is really coming on. Yes, there's still uncertainty in the economy, how this pandemic is going to end and how, some of the restrictions are going to be loosened over coming weeks and months. But generally speaking, we've seen that the economy, by and large, has been very, very resilient to that uncertainty, particularly after the first lockdown. Yes, there's issues around the extent of the lockdown in Auckland this time around, but my feeling is that, that pressure is just mounting on the Reserve Bank to take action, and, they may have to react a lot more than we would have been thinking previously.
Absolutely, and I think that's the challenge. We have inflation. It is real. It's in front of us. It's not anticipated or expected. It is here. We're seeing the economy in a stronger position, much hotter economic activity than was first anticipated from the pandemic, a labour market that is tight and unlikely to become any looser anytime soon. Those pressures are only going to build, and I agree. I think the Reserve Bank is going to have to move, and we're going to have to understand what this pathway forward, this recovery for New Zealand's economy means when we're still seeing higher prices and those constraints around economic activity. We'll figure out where those are heading next, what those pricing changes are going to mean for the economy, and how far those prices might go on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.